Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I am sharing 8 terrifying true Appalachian deep woods encounters. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Now, let's begin. I've been walking these Appalachian ridges for near 40 years now. First as a boy trailing behind my daddy's hunting parties, then as a park ranger myself for the better part of 2 decades. I thought I'd seen everything these ancient mountains had to offer: black bears protecting cubs, unexpected sinkholes that could swallow a man whole, weather that could turn deadly in minutes. But what happened to me on Grandfather Mountain that October night in 2019 still keeps me awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. It was my 3rd day tracking what we suspected was a large black bear that had been getting into campsites along the Blue Ridge section. Radio chatter had mentioned torn tents, scattered food supplies, and one witness claiming they'd seen something moving through the trees that was too big to be a bear, too wrong to be human. I figured it was just another case of city folks letting their imaginations run wild in country they didn't understand. The afternoon had been unseasonably warm for mid-October, but as evening settled over the ridge, that familiar Appalachian chill crept in through the gaps between my jacket layers. I was about 3 miles off the main trail, following what looked like fresh disturbances in the underbrush, broken branches, claw marks on tree bark, and scat that didn't quite match any bear sign I'd seen before. The deeper into the woods I went, the quieter everything became. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the leaf litter, not even the buzz of late-season insects. That's when I first heard the whistling. At first, I thought it might be wind through the trees. But there wasn't any wind that evening. The air hung still and heavy, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The sound was melodic, almost human, but with an odd warbling quality that made my skin crawl. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the rocky faces and bouncing between the ancient oak and poplar trees. I stopped walking and listened. The whistling continued for maybe 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of my own heartbeat, unnaturally loud in my ears. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" but got no response except the fading echo of my own voice. I continued following the trail sign, but now every shadow seemed deeper, every branch creak more ominous. The whistling started again about 10 minutes later, and this time I was sure it was following me. It stayed consistently off to my right, maybe 50 yards into the thick brush where the old-growth forest created an impenetrable wall of twisted trunks and thorny undergrowth. As darkness began settling over the mountains like a heavy blanket, I made the decision to set up camp in a small clearing I'd used before. I knew these woods well enough to navigate in daylight, but nighttime was different. Too many ways to take a wrong step and end up at the bottom of a ravine or lost in one of the countless unmarked hollows that spiderwebbed through this section of the range. I had my camp set up and a small fire crackling when the whistling started again. This time, it was closer, much closer. And now I could hear something else underneath it, a sound like heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, but with an odd rhythm. I looked up from adjusting my sleeping bag and saw a shape standing at the very edge of the firelight. It was tall, maybe 8 feet and wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. The proportions were all off. 2 long arms that hung nearly to the ground. A head that seemed too small for the body, or maybe too large, I couldn't tell. What I could see clearly were the eyes, reflecting the firelight like an animal's, but with an intelligence that made my blood freeze. The whistling was coming from. We stared at each other across the fire for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it began to move around the edge of the clearing, staying just at the boundary where firelight met darkness. The whistling never stopped, that same melodic warbling tune, but now I realized it was copying some half-remembered song from my childhood. Something my grandmother used to hum while she worked in her garden. I reached for my radio, never taking my eyes off the thing circling my camp. Static. I tried switching channels, adjusting the antenna. Nothing but white noise filled with what sounded almost like voices. speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The creature, I couldn't think of it as anything else, now completed its circuit of my camp and stopped directly across from me, the fire between us. When it opened its mouth, the whistling grew louder, more complex, like a whole choir of voices harmonizing that childhood lullaby. But underneath it, I could hear something else. Words spoken in perfect English with an accent I recognized as local mountain dialect. Been waiting for you, Ranger Man. Been watching you walk these hills, thinking you know what's up here in the deep woods. But you don't know nothing about what's been living in these mountains since before your people came with their roads and their rules. I tried to speak, to ask what it was, what it wanted, but no sound came out. My throat felt locked, like something was squeezing it from the inside, way inside. I remember when these trees were saplings, it continued, stepping closer to the fire. The light revealed more details I wished I couldn't see. Skin that looked like bark, fingers that ended in what might have been claws or might have been gnarled twigs. I remember the Cherokee who used to leave offerings at the old places, who knew better than to come up here alone when the moon was dark. They had respect. The fire suddenly flared higher, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. In that brief moment of brighter light, I saw its face clearly. It might have been human once, or something that had learned to wear a human face, but time, and whatever force had changed it, had left it as something else entirely. The features were still there: eyes, nose, mouth, but they were arranged wrong, like a child's drawing of a person made by someone who had never actually seen one. "You've been tracking something you thought was just an animal," it said, and I realized with growing horror that it was right. The disturbances, the claw marks, the strange scat, it had all been this thing, and it had been leading me here deliberately. But I ain't no animal ranger man. I'm what happens when someone gets too deep into these mountains and finds the old places, the places where the world gets thin. The whistling grew so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The creature laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "You got two choices," it said, beginning to circle the fire again. "You can try to leave, try to find your way back to your truck and your people in your safe little world. But these mountains don't like to let go once they got their hooks in you. Every trail's gonna look the same, every ridge gonna lead you back here to me." It paused directly behind me, and I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and smelling of earth and decay. "Or you can stay, learn what I learned, become what I became." The mountains always need another guardian, another voice in the deep woods to guide the lost ones home. I made my choice. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a man possessed, branches tearing at my clothes and face, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, the whistling grew fainter, but it never stopped completely. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I collapsed beside what I finally recognized as the main trail. When the search and rescue team found me the next morning, I was hypothermic and delirious, babbling about whistling and creatures and old mountain songs. They said I'd been missing for 4 days, though I could have sworn it was only one night. My camping gear was never found, and the clearing where I'd made camp seemed to have vanished entirely. I took early retirement 6 months later. Couldn't bring myself to go back into those deep woods. Couldn't trust my own eyes and ears anymore. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still hear it, that whistling, calling to me from the ridges, reminding me that some parts of these ancient mountains will never be mapped or tamed or understood. And I know that somewhere up there in the places where the maps end and the old world begins, it's still waiting for the next lone hiker to follow the trail signs a little too far into the dark. My family's been living in these Kentucky hills since before Kentucky was even a state, back when it was all just wilderness and Cherokee hunting grounds. 5 generations of Hensleys have worked the small farm tucked into what we call Deadman's Hollow, though none of us ever talked much about why it got that name. "Some family secrets are better left buried," my daddy used to say. I wish I'd listened to him. It was the summer of 2020, right in the thick of all that pandemic craziness. I'd come back home to help Mama with the farm after losing my job in Louisville. The isolation didn't bother me much. I'd grown up with these rolling hills and thick forests as my backyard. But there was something different about the hollow that summer, something that made even the old hound dogs whine and refuse to go near the tree line after dark. The trouble started when I decided to clear out some of the overgrown section on the far end of our property. There was maybe 5 acres of good pasture land buried under 20 years of briars and volunteer trees, and with money tight, every bit of usable space mattered. Mama had been after me to tackle it for years, but something about that particular patch of land had always made me uncomfortable. The trees grew different there, twisted and stunted, with bark that looked diseased even when it wasn't. Animals avoided it. Even the crows wouldn't land there. But practical needs won out over superstition, and I started working that section with my chainsaw and brush hog in the early morning hours before the heat became unbearable. The work went slower than it should have. My equipment kept acting up. The chainsaw would die for no reason. The brush hog would clog with vines that seemed tougher than steel cable. But I was determined to see it through. 3 days into the clearing work, I found the first stone. It was about the size of a dinner plate, flat and circular, with symbols carved deep into its surface. Not letters or numbers, but something older, spirals and angular marks that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stone was buried about 6 inches down, nestled between the roots of an old oak tree that must have been growing around it for decades. I should have left it alone. Should have covered it back up and found another section of property to clear. But curiosity got the better of me and I pried it loose with my shovel. The moment I lifted it from the ground, the forest went dead quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing in Deadman's Hollow, but that wasn't the overgrown wilderness I'd been clearing. It was neat and cultivated, with crops I didn't recognize growing in perfect rows. People moved between the plants, but they weren't quite people. They were tall and thin, with skin that had a greenish tint and fingers too long for human hands. They were tending the strange crops with careful, practiced movements, and they were singing. The song was wordless but hauntingly beautiful, with harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. As I watched, one of the figures looked up and saw me. Its eyes were completely black, like pools of deep water, and when it smiled, I saw that its teeth were pointed like thorns. The watcher returns, it said, though its lips didn't move. The blood remembers. Remembers. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding like I'd been running. Outside my bedroom window, I could see the cleared section of the hollow, and something was moving among the stumps and brush piles. Tall shadows that swayed without any wind, dancing to music I couldn't hear but somehow felt in my bones. The next day, I found 3 more stones. They were arranged in a rough triangle around the first one, each carved with similar symbols, but in different patterns. As I uncovered them, that unnatural silence fell over the forest again. This time, though, I also caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn, the sickly sweet smell of flowers left too long in stagnant water. That evening, as I was cleaning up my tools, I noticed something growing where I'd removed the stones. Small plants, no bigger than my thumb, but unlike anything I'd ever seen. They had thick, fleshy leaves that were almost translucent and tiny flowers that seemed to pulse with their own light. I knelt down for a closer look and realized they were growing in a pattern, the same angular spirals that had been carved into the stones. The dreams came stronger that night. This time, I wasn't just watching, I was participating. I found myself working alongside the strange figures, tending crops that moved and whispered when I touched them. My hands were different, longer, thinner, with skin that had that same greenish tint. And I understood, somehow, that this was what the hollow had always been for. This was its purpose. "Your people knew," one of the figures told me as we worked. 5 generations ago, they made the bargain. The land would provide, but only if the covenant was kept. Only if the stones stayed buried and the old ways were honored. I wanted to ask what covenant, what bargain, but before I could speak, I was back in my own bed, gasping for air and covered in sweat. Outside, dawn was breaking, and I could hear something that made my blood freeze, singing. The same wordless, beautiful song from my dreams drifting up from the hollow on the morning breeze. By the 4th day, I'd uncovered a complete circle of stones, 12 in all, each one unique but clearly part of a larger design. The plants growing where they'd been buried were now knee-high and swaying in patterns that had nothing to do with any wind. And the smell was getting stronger, that rotting flower stench that seemed to cling to my clothes and hair no matter how many times I showered. That's when I decided to do some research. I drove into town and spent the day at the Historical Society, digging through old records and land surveys. What I found made my hands shake as I turned the pages. The hollow had belonged to my family since 1847, when my great-great-grandfather Ezekiel Hensley had purchased it for a fraction of what similar land was going for. The previous owners, a Cherokee family, had sold it with the specific condition that certain traditions be maintained. There were references to sacred grounds and seasonal obligations and something called the feeding of the old ones. But the most disturbing entry was in Ezekiel's own handwriting in a journal I'd never seen before. The stones must stay buried. The bargain must be kept. What grows in the hollow feeds more than the land it feeds what sleeps beneath. God help me. I've seen them in the dreams. I know what they want. But the crops are good, the children are healthy, and the Cherokee woman says it will stay that way as long as we hold to the old ways. I was still reading when the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, came over to my table. She was a local woman, maybe 70 years old, who'd grown up hearing all the old mountain stories, researching your family history, and she asked, but there was something in her voice that suggested she already knew why I was there. Something like that, I said. I'm curious about some of the old traditions mentioned in these records. She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in close. Your family's hollow has quite a reputation, young man. My grandmother used to say the Cherokee called it a feeding place somewhere the old spirits came to sustain themselves. She said your people made an agreement to tend it in exchange for good harvests and protection. What kind of agreement? Mrs. Patterson straightened up and shook her head. Some things are better left alone. But if you've been digging around up there, disturbing things that were meant to stay buried. She paused and looked me straight in the eye. Well, I'd suggest you put everything back the way you found it. Some bargains don't have expiration dates. I drove home as the sun was setting, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in my head. As I came around the bend that led to our farm, I could see lights in the hollow, not electric lights, but something softer, more organic. They pulsed and swayed like living things, and they were arranged in the same pattern as the stones I'd uncovered. The plants had grown again. They were now taller than I was, with leaves that rustled and whispered even though there was no wind. And as I watched from my truck, afraid to get any closer, I saw figures moving among them. The same tall, thin shapes from my dreams, tending their impossible garden in the growing darkness. One of them looked up at me and smiled with those thorn-sharp teeth. When it raised its hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a summons, I gunned the engine and drove straight to Mama's house without looking back. I spent that night on her couch listening to her snore peacefully in the next room and trying to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by too much sun and too little sleep. But when morning came, I knew I had to go back. The hollow was calling to me in ways I couldn't ignore, and I understood with growing dread that I was part of whatever ancient agreement my ancestor had made. The stones were back in place when I returned, sunk deep into the earth as if they'd never been disturbed. The strange plants were gone, leaving only normal grass and weeds. But carved into the bark of the old oak tree in letters that looked like they'd been burned rather than cut was a message. The covenant is renewed, the debt is paid, the watcher has returned. I never finished clearing that section of the hollow. Mama doesn't ask about it anymore, and I don't volunteer any explanations. But sometimes on nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, I can hear them out there singing their wordless songs and tending their impossible garden. And I know that someday, maybe not this year or next, but someday, I'll have to go back down into Deadman's Hollow and take my place among the watchers. After all, some family traditions run deeper than blood. I've been cutting timber in these West Virginia mountains for 32 years, working for 3 different companies and seeing logging operations from Pennsylvania down to North Carolina. In all that time, I thought I'd encountered every danger these ancient hills could throw at a man widowmakers hanging 40 feet up, equipment failures in country where cell phones don't work, weather that can turn deadly without warning. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what I found in the stand of old-growth timber we called Devil's Backbone Ridge. It was September of 2018, and our crew had been contracted to selectively harvest a section of private land that hadn't been touched in over a century. The trees were massive white oaks and tulip poplars that had been growing since before the Civil War, some of them 8 feet across at the base. It was the kind of timber that makes a logger's mouth water. Each tree worth more than most people make in a month. But from the first day we set up on that ridge, something felt wrong. The local crew we'd hired to help with the operation was nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders and making excuses to head down the mountain before dark. When I asked our foreman, a local man named Jake Corder who'd lived in these hills all his life, what had them spooked, he just shook his head and said, "Some places got a feel to them, you know. This ridge has always had a bad reputation." I'd heard that kind of superstitious talk before and didn't pay it much mind. Mountains have always bred stories, and mountain folk tend to be cautious about places their grandfathers told them to avoid. But as we started our work, I began to understand what Jake was talking about. For one thing, the wildlife was all wrong. In 32 years of logging, I'd never seen a forest so devoid of animal life. No squirrels chattering in the canopy, no birds calling from branch to branch, not even the buzz of insects that usually made summer work in the woods almost unbearable. The only sounds were our chainsaws and the crash of falling timber echoing off the surrounding ridges. Then there were the trees themselves. They were old, no question about that, but they were also shaped wrong somehow. Many of them had grown in spirals, their trunks twisted like someone had been wringing them out like wet rags. Others had bizarre growths, massive burls that looked almost like faces, or branches that curved back on themselves in impossible knots. Jake told me old-timers called them haint trees that had been touched by something unnatural, but we had a job to do and bills to pay, so we kept working. It was slow going with trees that size, and the twisted growth patterns made every cut unpredictable. A tree that should have fallen cleanly to the east might suddenly twist and come down sideways, taking out equipment and nearly crushing whoever was running the saw. 3 days into the job, we started finding the bones. They were scattered around the base of the largest oak on the ridge, a monster that must have been growing for 300 years. At first, we thought they were deer bones, maybe animals that had died naturally and been scattered by scavengers. But when Jake took a closer look, his face went white. "These ain't deer bones," he said, picking up what looked like a thigh bone that was too long and too thick to belong to any animal I knew. "And they ain't human either." We should have reported the find to the authorities, should have stopped work until someone could come out and investigate. But the company was already behind schedule on the contract, and the landowner was breathing down our necks about getting the valuable timber out before winter weather made the mountain roads impassable. So we decided to work around the bone site and keep the discovery to ourselves. Jake gathered up what we'd found and buried it all in a single hole about 50 yards away from the big oak. "Better to leave the dead be," he muttered as he shoveled dirt over the makeshift grave. "Some things don't like being disturbed." That night, alone in my trailer at the base of the mountain, I had dreams like nothing I'd ever experienced. I was standing on the ridge in bright daylight, but the forest was different. The trees were even larger, forming a canopy so thick that almost no sunlight reached the ground. And moving between those massive trunks were shapes that made my sleeping mind recoil in horror. They were tall, maybe 12 feet, and thin as saplings, but with too many joints in their arms and legs. Their skin looked like bark, rough and ridged, and their faces were holes in the wood where features should have been. They moved through the forest with a fluid grace that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and as they moved, they sang. The song was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not music exactly, but a sound like wind through leaves combined with the deep groaning of old wood under stress. It seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the entire forest was one vast instrument being played by these impossible creatures. In the dream, one of them noticed me and approached with that same fluid stride. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of branches rubbing together in a storm. "You cut the old ones," it said. "You spill their blood and scatter their bones. Why do you wound the forest? I tried to explain about the logging contract about making a living, but the words came out as nothing but wind. The creature reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched my forehead, and suddenly I could see the ridge as it truly was, not just a stand of timber to be harvested, but a living community that had existed for centuries. The trees are not wood, it said. They are the bones of the world, the pillars that hold up the sky, and we are their guardians, their voice in the deep places where your kind fears to go. I woke up gasping, my trailer filled with the scent of pine and decay. Outside, I could hear something moving in the forest, the sound of large bodies brushing against trees, accompanied by that same otherworldly singing from my dream. The next morning, our equipment wouldn't start. Chainsaws that had been running perfectly the day before were dead. Their engines seized up as if they'd been running for years without oil. The feller buncher, a massive piece of machinery that had never given us a day's trouble, had a cracked engine block and hydraulic lines that looked like they'd been chewed through by something with very large teeth. Jake took one look at the damage and shook his head. "We need to get off this mountain," he said. "Today." But we couldn't leave the equipment, and it would take days to get mechanics up the logging road to assess the damage. So we spent the day trying to make temporary repairs while constantly feeling like we were being watched. The sensation was so strong that I found myself spinning around every few minutes, sure I'd catch sight of something lurking in the underbrush. That evening, as we were packing up our tools, Jake grabbed my arm and pointed up into the canopy of the big oak we'd been avoiding. There, maybe 60 feet up, something was moving among the branches. It was too dark to see clearly, but whatever it was large and seemed to be flowing from branch to branch like liquid. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. Equipment or no equipment, we're getting off this ridge. But morning brought a sight that made leaving impossible. Sometime during the night, every tree we'd cut had returned to its original position. The massive trunks that we'd spent days felling and cutting into logs were standing upright again as if they'd never been touched. The stumps we'd left behind were gone, covered over with new growth that looked like it had been there for decades. And carved into the bark of the big oak in letters that looked like they'd been burned rather than cut was a message. The forest protects itself. Leave now or join the bones beneath the roots. We didn't argue with the warning. Jake and I hiked down the mountain that morning, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment and the most lucrative logging contract either of us had ever seen. The company wasn't happy about it, and we both lost our jobs over the abandoned gear. But I've never regretted the decision to walk away, because sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees around my house, I can still hear that otherworldly singing. And I know that somewhere up on Devil's Backbone Ridge, the guardians are still watching, still protecting the old ways and the ancient bones buried deep beneath the forest floor. I never went back to logging after that. Some kinds of work aren't worth what they cost a man's soul. And some forests are meant to stay wild, no matter how much money their timber might be worth. I've been spelunking in the Appalachian cave systems for close to 20 years now, mapping uncharted passages and helping with rescue operations when tourists get themselves lost in places they don't understand. The mountains are honeycombed with limestone caverns, some of them extending for miles underground, and I've seen chambers so beautiful they'd take your breath away and passages so tight you have to exhale just to squeeze through. But I've never encountered anything like what I found in the unmapped system beneath Blackwater Falls, Virginia in the winter of 2021. Some caves call to you with their mystery and beauty. This one called to me with something else entirely, something that I'm still trying to understand and trying even harder to forget. I'd gotten word of the cave system from a local farmer whose cattle had been avoiding a particular section of his pasture. When he investigated, he found a sinkhole that had opened up after the heavy rains that fall, revealing a passage that seemed to extend deep into the mountain. He tossed a rock into the opening and listened for nearly 30 seconds before hearing it hit bottom. That kind of depth usually meant extensive cave networks, and I was eager to be the first to explore and map whatever lay beneath his land. The entrance was about 4 feet across, dropping straight down into darkness for what my equipment measured as roughly 300 feet. I rigged my rappelling gear and made the descent on a cold January morning when the air was so still I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The shaft opened into a chamber larger than any I'd encountered in 2 decades of caving. My headlamp beam couldn't reach the far walls, and when I tossed a handful of pebbles to gauge the size, the sound of their landing came back to me from at least 6 different directions. The floor was covered with a thick layer of what looked like sand, but when I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized it was actually composed of tiny bone fragments worn smooth by centuries of water flow. That should have been my first warning to turn around and climb back to the surface. Instead, I spent the next hour mapping the chamber and identifying multiple passages leading deeper into the mountain. The cave system was extensive, easily one of the largest I'd encountered in this region. But it was also wrong in ways that my trained eye picked up immediately. The passages were too symmetrical, too deliberately shaped. Natural caves are chaotic things, carved by water following the path of least resistance through rock. These tunnels looked like they'd been purposefully excavated. I chose the largest passage and began working my way deeper into the mountain. The tunnel sloped steadily downward, and after about a quarter mile, I began noticing formations that defied geological explanation. The walls were covered with spiral patterns that looked almost like writing carved deep into the limestone. And the air was wrong, not the cool, still atmosphere you expect in deep caves, but warm and humid, with a smell that reminded me of reptile houses at the zoo. 2 hours into my exploration, I heard the first call. It came from somewhere ahead of me in the passage, a sound like nothing I'd ever encountered. If I had to describe it, I'd say it was like whale song filtered through human vocal cords, a low, melodious howling that seemed to carry meanings I couldn't quite grasp. The sound echoed off the cave walls, distorting and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stopped and listened, trying to identify the source. My first thought was that another caver was in the system, maybe someone who'd found a different entrance and was now lost and calling for help. But no human throat could have produced that sound, and the echoes suggested it was coming from much deeper in the cave than any sane person would venture alone. I called out, "Hello? Do you need assistance?" But got no response except my own voice bouncing back from the limestone walls. The mysterious calling had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the steady drip of water from somewhere in the darkness ahead. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of exploring dangerous underground spaces was telling me to retreat to the surface and return with a full team. But that call had awakened something in me, a compulsion to move deeper, to find the source of that haunting sound. The passage began to change as I continued downward. The carved spirals on the walls became more elaborate, forming patterns that seemed to shift and move in the light of my headlamp. And the bone fragments on the floor were larger now, more recognizable as pieces of skulls and rib cages from animals I couldn't identify. That's when I found the first chamber of bones. It was a natural amphitheater carved out of the living rock, maybe 200 feet across and shaped like a perfect circle. The walls rose in tiers like seating in an ancient theater, and every surface was covered with bones. Not scattered randomly, but arranged in deliberate patterns, spirals, and geometric shapes that matched the carvings on the passage walls. But these weren't animal bones. They were too large, too strangely proportioned. Skulls the size of basketballs with eye sockets too big and jaw structures that looked designed for tearing rather than chewing. Arm and leg bones that were too long and jointed in too many places. And scattered among them small piles of what looked like shed skin, dried and leathery and covered with scales. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water so dark it looked like a hole cut in the cave floor. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting my headlamp like black glass. And as I approached the edge, I heard the calling again, this time coming from directly beneath the water. I knelt at the pool's edge and shone my light down into the depths. The water was clear despite its dark appearance, and I could see the bottom maybe 20 feet down. But there was something else down there, something that made my hands shake as I tried to keep my light steady. Shapes were moving in the depths, large serpentine forms that undulated through the water with impossible grace. As I watched, one of them rose toward the surface, and I got a clear look at something that my rational mind still refuses to fully accept. It was easily 30 feet long, with a body like a massive snake, but covered in scales that seemed to shift color in my light. Its head was vaguely reptilian, but with too many eyes arranged around a mouth full of teeth designed for rending flesh, and along its sides it had appendages that might have been arms or fins, ending in what looked disturbingly like clawed hands. The creature, for lack of a better word, rose to within a few feet of the surface and looked directly at me with those multiple eyes. When it opened its mouth, the calling sound filled the chamber, but this time I could understand it. Not the words, but the meaning behind them. It was asking me to come closer, to enter the water, to join the others who had answered its call over the centuries. That's when I understood what the bone chamber really was. It wasn't a natural formation or even a burial ground. It was a feeding site. The remains of everyone who had heard that hypnotic call and followed it into the depths of the mountain. And the patterns on the walls, the spiral carvings, they weren't decorative. They were territorial markers, warnings in a language older than human civilization. I backed away from the pool on shaking legs, my headlamp beam dancing wildly across the bone-covered walls. But as I turned to flee, I saw that I was no longer alone in the chamber. Shapes were emerging from passages I hadn't noticed before, the same serpentine forms I'd seen in the water. But these were moving across land with the aid of those clawed appendages. The calling grew louder, more insistent, and I felt my will beginning to weaken. Part of me wanted to stop running, to turn around, and accept whatever these creatures were offering. There was something peaceful about the idea of letting go, of joining the bones that decorated their underground sanctuary. But 20 years of cave rescue work had taught me to push through panic and fear, to find the rational part of my mind even in the most terrifying situations. I forced myself to focus on my escape route, to remember the path I'd taken to reach this nightmare chamber. The creatures pursued me as I ran, but they moved differently outside the water, slower and more awkward. I could hear them sliding across the stone behind me, their calls growing more desperate as I put distance between us, but they didn't follow me beyond the bone chamber. It was as if they were bound to that dark pool and couldn't venture too far from its depths. I made it back to the main chamber and up my ropes in record time, hauling myself out of that accursed cave with strength born of pure terror. When I reached the surface, I collapsed beside the farmer's sinkhole and vomited until my stomach was empty, the taste of that underground air still burning in my throat. I filed no reports about what I'd found beneath Blackwater Falls. No cave maps, no geological surveys, no recommendations for further exploration. Instead, I convinced the farmer to fill in the sinkhole and told him his cattle had good instincts about avoiding dangerous ground. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the darkness feels especially thick, I can hear that calling again. Not from any cave or underground passage, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the spaces between sleep and waking, where old things wait for new voices to join their eternal song. I gave up caving after that experience. Some discoveries aren't meant to be mapped or cataloged or shared with the scientific community. Some things are better left in the dark, where they've been waiting since before human beings learned to fear the spaces beneath the earth. 5. The fire tower vigil. I spent 15 summers working as a fire lookout in the Monongahela National Forest, perched in towers that rose above the canopy like steel fingers pointing at the sky. It's solitary work that attracts a certain kind of person, those who prefer the company of mountains and trees to the noise and complications of human society. Most days you see nothing but endless green hills rolling away to the horizon, broken only by the occasional wisp of smoke from a legal campfire or the scar of an old logging road. But in the summer of 2017, working the tower on Spruce Knob Ridge, I saw things that no fire lookout manual had prepared me for. Things that made me question everything I thought I knew about these ancient mountains and what watches us from the spaces between the trees. The tower itself was 120 feet tall, putting me well above the forest canopy with a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. On clear days, I could see for 40 miles in every direction ridges and valleys that stretched away like a green ocean, punctuated by the occasional glimpse of a distant town or the ribbon of a highway cutting through the wilderness. I'd been up there for about 6 weeks when I first noticed the lights. They appeared just after sunset on a Tuesday evening in late July, when the sky had faded to deep purple but wasn't quite black yet. At first, I thought they were headlights from vehicles on one of the forest roads, but they were moving wrong, too slow and too steady, following no path that showed up on any of my topographic maps. There were maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a rough line and moving through the valley about 5 miles southwest of my position. They glowed with a soft, steady light that reminded me of phosphorus, and as I watched through my binoculars, they seemed to be floating about 10 feet off the ground. I radioed the report to the ranger station, describing what I was seeing and asking if there were any authorized night operations in that sector. The response came back negative: no scheduled activities, no known campers with permits for that area, and no roads or trails where vehicles could be operating. Keep an eye on them, the duty ranger told me. Log the time and location and let us know if they do anything unusual. The lights continued their slow procession through the valley for about 20 minutes, then simply vanished. Not like someone had turned off a switch, but more like they'd simply faded away into the darkness. I made my log entry and forgot about it, figuring it was probably just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon or maybe illegal spotlighting that wasn't any of my business to investigate. But the lights came back the next night, and the night after that. Always the same time, just after sunset, when the darkness was settling over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Always the same number 12 distinct points of light moving in that slow, steady line. And always following the same route through the valley, a path that seemed to lead from nowhere to nowhere according to every map I had. By the end of the week, I was obsessed with them. I started setting up my most powerful binoculars and camera equipment every evening, trying to get a better look at what was creating the lights. But no matter how much I magnified the image, they remained just points of soft, steady illumination moving through the darkness with no visible source. That's when I decided to try the night vision scope. It was equipment I wasn't supposed to have in the tower, a military-grade scope I'd picked up at a surplus store and kept for watching wildlife during my off-duty hours. But when I aimed it at the lights that Thursday night, what I saw through the green-tinted image made my blood freeze. The lights weren't vehicles or atmospheric phenomena. They were being carried, held aloft by figures that moved through the forest with a fluid, inhuman grace. The figures themselves were tall and thin, maybe 8 feet in height, and seemed to be wearing robes or cloaks that float around them like liquid shadow. But their proportions were all wrong. 2 long arms that nearly reached the ground, heads that seemed too small for their bodies. And a way of moving that suggested their joints bent in ways human joints weren't meant to bend. I watched them for the full 20 minutes of their procession, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the scope steady. When they vanished, simply fading away like smoke, I set down the equipment and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, isolation, too much coffee, and not enough human contact. All the standard explanations for why people in remote assignment start seeing things that aren't there. But I knew what I'd seen was real. The next night brought a change in the pattern. The lights appeared as usual, but this time, they didn't follow their normal route through the valley. Instead, they turned toward my tower and began moving directly across the forest floor in my direction. I watched through the night vision scope as the figures approached, carrying their mysterious lights through the underbrush with that same impossible grace. They moved in complete silence, no breaking branches, no rustling leaves, no sound at all, despite the fact that they were traveling through dense forest. When they reached the base of my tower, they stopped. 12 figures arranged in a perfect circle around the steel structure, their lights casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And then, as I watched in growing terror, they began to climb. Not the ladder, they didn't need ladders. They moved up the steel framework like spiders, their 2 long limbs finding purchase on beams and supports that should have been impossible to grip. The lights they carried seemed to float alongside them, maintaining their position relative to each figure as they ascended toward my cab. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but got nothing but static filled with what sounded like voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual at that height, but even my emergency satellite communicator was dead. The first figure reached my level and pressed its face against the window of the lookout cab. In the reflected glow of its light, I could see features that might have been human once, but had been changed by time and forces I couldn't comprehend. The skin was pale and translucent like old parchment, and the eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye socket, as if they were windows looking into empty space. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing inside my skull rather than through my ears. "Firewatcher," it said, and the words carried meanings beyond their simple sound. "You have seen us in our passages. You have watched when you should have looked away." The other figures had reached my level now, surrounding the cab on all sides. Their lights pulsed in unison, creating patterns that seemed to bypass my eyes and speak directly to some deeper part of my brain. "We walk the old paths," the creature continued, "the ways that were here before your kind learned to fear the dark." But the watcher sees, and seeing changes the nature of what is watched. I tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but my voice wouldn't work. It was as if the air had become too thick to carry sound, or as if my throat had forgotten how to form words. You have a choice, Firewatcher. Join us in our passages, learn the deep roads that run beneath the world, or forget what you have seen and never watch again. As it spoke, one of the lights drifted closer to the window. In its glow, I could see the forest spread out below, but it wasn't the same forest I'd been watching for 15 summers. The trees were different, older, larger, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And moving between them were more figures, hundreds of them, carrying their lights along paths that crisscrossed the mountains in an intricate web of illumination. "The fire roads are nothing compared to the paths we walk," the creature said. "The small fires you watch for are candles compared to the flames we tend in the deep places." The choice it offered wasn't really a choice at all. I could feel the pull of those lights, the promise of secrets and knowledge that humans weren't meant to possess. Part of me wanted to open the door of the cab and step out onto the tower platform to accept whatever transformation would allow me to join their midnight processions. But a stronger part of me, the part that had kept me sane through 15 summers of isolation, knew that some invitations shouldn't be accepted. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. "I choose to forget," I whispered, the words scraping my throat like broken glass. The creature studied me with those empty black eyes for a long moment. Then it nodded, a gesture that was somehow both human and utterly alien. "Then sleep, Firewatcher. Sleep and forget. Dream of normal fires and natural lights." The last thing I remembered was the sound of those lights fading away, taking with them the strange figures and their impossible invitation. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was slumped over my desk with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I found an entry in my logbook, written in handwriting that looked like mine but felt foreign. No incidents to report. A standard night watch completed without event. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of lights moving through the forest. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can hear voices calling to me from the darkness between the trees, reminding me of paths I chose not to walk and fires I chose not to tend. I finished out that summer and put in for a transfer to a desk job in the regional office. Some kinds of watching change the watcher, and some fires are too dangerous to keep an eye on. The mountains can keep their secrets. I've seen enough to know that some lights are better left unobserved. And the cars parked around town, while they looked normal from a distance, were all old models, nothing newer than maybe the 1970s. I was still trying to process what I was seeing when a man emerged from Riley's store. He was maybe 60 years old, wearing coveralls and a smile that seemed genuine enough, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way he moved, too smooth, too quiet, like he was floating rather than walking. Or maybe it was his eyes, which seemed to reflect the light from the gas station like an animal's eyes in headlights. "Evening, stranger," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence. "Don't get many big rigs through Cedar Hollow. You must be taking the detour on account of that rock slide." "That's right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through, looking to fuel up and get back on the road." "Oh, you can fuel up all right," he said, that strange smile never wavering. "But I'm afraid you might be staying a bit longer than you planned. See, we don't get many visitors here, and when we do, well, we like to make sure they feel welcome." Something in his tone made me look more carefully at the diner and the motel. The people I'd seen through the windows were still there, but they weren't moving. They were sitting perfectly still, as if frozen in the middle of whatever they'd been doing. And their faces, now that I could see them more clearly, had that same unnatural stillness as the man in front of me. "I appreciate the hospitality," I said, finishing with the fuel pump and moving to replace the nozzle, "but I need to get this load delivered on schedule. Maybe some other time." "Oh, but there won't be any other time," the man said, and now his smile had changed into something that wasn't friendly at all. "You see, Cedar Hollow isn't the kind of place you just pass through. It's the kind of place you stay, whether you want to or not." That's when I noticed that my truck wouldn't start. I turned the key and the engine turned over like normal, but it wouldn't catch. Just kept cranking without ever firing up. I tried again, pumping the accelerator, checking my gauges. Everything looked normal, but the engine refused to start. "Flying, having some trouble?" the man asked, moving closer to my cab. "That's a shame. Guess you'll be spending the night after all. We've got a real nice room at the motel, and Mabel makes the best apple pie in 3 counties." I kept trying to start the engine, growing more desperate with each failed attempt. In the mirrors, I could see more people emerging from the buildings around town, men and women of various ages, all with that same too-smooth way of moving and those same reflective eyes. They were gathering around my truck in a loose circle, not threatening exactly, but definitely not letting me leave either. "What is this place?" I asked the man, who was now standing right next to my driver's door. "Cedar Hollow," he said, as if that explained everything. "Been here longer than most folks remember. We get travelers through from time to time, people who take the wrong road, or follow the wrong signs, or just happen to be passing by when the fog rolls in thick enough to hide the usual ways." "And what happens to these travelers?" His smile returned, wider than before. "They become part of the community, of course. Cedar Hollow always needs new people, fresh blood to keep things interesting. And once you're here, well, once you're part of the family, you never want to leave." I looked around at the faces surrounding my truck and realized with growing horror that they weren't all the same age they appeared to be. Some of them had the same weathered, timeless quality as the man at my window. Others looked younger, more recent, with clothing and hairstyles from different decades. One woman had the big hair and bright makeup of the 1980s. But their personal gear was gone, and there were tracks leading away from the camp into terrain so rough that no sane hiker would attempt it without ropes and technical equipment. The second incident involved a solo hiker, a geology professor from the University of Kentucky who'd been studying the unique limestone formations in that area. He checked in with our ranger station 3 days earlier, saying he planned to collect samples from some caves he'd identified on satellite imagery. Like the couple from Ohio, we found his base camp undisturbed, but the man himself had vanished without a trace. The third disappearance was what prompted our major search operation. A family of 4 from Louisville parents and 2 teenage kids had been day hiking on one of the marked trails when they simply vanished. Their car was still in the parking area. Their day packs were found abandoned on the trail, and witnesses reported hearing screams coming from the direction of Dead Horse Gap around sunset. 3 search teams, 50 volunteers, state police with helicopters, and tracking dogs. We turned that section of forest inside out for 2 weeks. What we found was impossible to explain, and even harder to believe. The tracks led deep into a hollow that didn't appear on any of our topographic maps, accessed through a narrow gap in the rock face that you could easily walk past without noticing. The passage was maybe 4 feet wide and seemed to squeeze even tighter as it went deeper into the mountain, but all the missing persons tracks led that way, and the dogs insisted that the scent trail continued into the darkness. I volunteered to lead the first team into the passage, along with 2 other rangers and a state police investigator. We went in with full technical gear, ropes, lights, communication equipment, everything we needed for a potential cave rescue. But what we found wasn't a cave system. It was something else entirely. The passage opened into a natural amphitheater carved out of the limestone, maybe 100 feet across and surrounded by sheer walls that rose straight up for what our lights couldn't measure. But the space was filled with structures that had no business being their buildings, if you could call them that, made from stone and timber and materials I couldn't identify. They weren't human constructions. The proportions were all wrong, with doorways too tall and narrow for normal people, and stairs that seemed designed for legs that bent differently than ours. And they were older than any European settlement in Kentucky, older than any known Native American sites in the region. But they weren't empty. We found evidence of recent habitation: cold fire pits with still warm ashes, food stores that included both recognizable supplies and things that made my stomach turn to look at. And we found clothing. Pieces of fabric and personal items that matched the descriptions of what our missing persons had been wearing when they disappeared. That's when we heard the singing. It came from deeper in the hollow, from passages that led further into the mountain than our lights could penetrate. Multiple voices harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize, but with a melody that seemed hauntingly familiar. The sound echoed off the stone walls, creating patterns that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to some primitive part of my brain. My partner, Ranger Jake Morrison, started walking toward the sound before any of us realized what was happening. He moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes unfocused, but his steps sure and purposeful. When we tried to stop him, he fought us with a strength that seemed inhuman, all the while muttering words in that same unknown language we could hear in the singing. We managed to restrain him and get him back to the surface, but it took all three of us to drag him away from the hollow. And even after we'd hiked 2 miles back to our vehicles, he kept looking over his shoulder and mumbling about the old families and the deep houses and the invitation that can't be refused. Jake was never the same after that. He took early retirement 6 months later and moved to Florida, as far from mountains and caves as he could get. But before he left, he pulled me aside and told me what he'd seen in those last few moments before we grabbed him. They were there, he said, his eyes haunted by memories I hoped I'd never have to share. Our missing persons, all of them. But they weren't prisoners, weren't being held against their will. They'd joined something, become part of something that's been living in those deep places since before human beings learned to fear the dark. We filed our reports and waited for orders from the regional office. The investigation was taken over by federal authorities who asked a lot of questions and shared no answers. The hollow beyond Dead Horse Gap was declared off-limits, and that section of the forest was quietly removed from all public maps and trail guides. But I kept thinking about what Jake had said and about the singing we'd heard in that impossible place, so I did some research, digging through old archives and historical records, trying to find some explanation for what we'd encountered. What I found was a pattern stretching back over 2 centuries, reports of disappearances in that exact area dating back to the earliest European settlements in Kentucky. Native American oral histories that spoke of the hungry places where spirits dwelled that could call people into the deep earth. Even older stories passed down from indigenous peoples who'd lived in the region long before the Cherokee about places where the boundary between the world above and the world below grew thin. The final piece came from a journal I found in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, written by a surveyor named Thomas Hensley in 1847. He'd been mapping that section of the forest for the state government and had encountered something in the hollow beyond Dead Horse Gap that he described as a settlement of peoples unknown, dwelling in houses carved from the living. My name's Elias Crow. I've been a trail warden in the Pisgah National Forest for over 30 years, long enough to know every bend in the creek, every moss-covered boulder, every whisper the wind carries through the hemlocks. Folks call me Old Crow, not 'cause I'm mean, but 'cause I see things others don't. And I survive things others, well, they don't. This story ain't about a bear or a lost hiker. This is about the hollow behind Blackroot Ridge, the one marked with red X's on our ranger maps. Officially, it's unmapped terrain. Unofficially, we call it the hollow that breathes back. And I went in there alone, on purpose. It was October 2017. Mist clung to the ground like wet gauze. I'd gotten a report from a college kid who swore he saw something tall and skinless watching him from behind a waterfall near Devil's Elbow. He didn't come back outright, shaking, mumbling about the trees opening. I figured dehydration, hallucinations. Until I found his boot split down the middle like something peeled it open with its fingers. I entered the hollow just past noon. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy. The air, it didn't smell like pine or damp earth. It smelled like copper and burnt hair. My radio crackled once, static shaped like a human sigh, then died. GPS spun in circles. Compass needle trembled, then pointed straight down. That's when I heard it. Not a growl, not a growl, not a scream. A breath, slow, wet, deliberate, coming from the ridge above me, like lungs the size of oil drums expanding in the dark. I moved cautiously, marking trees with orange tape, but when I turned back, the tape was gone, replaced by thin strips of what looked like skin, pale, hairless, still warm. Then came the sounds, footsteps, bare feet slapping wet stone, always just behind me, never catching up, never falling behind, just pacing, matching my rhythm. When I stopped, it stopped. When I ran, it ran. Faster. I reached an old moonshiner's shack, half collapsed, smelling of mold and something sweetly rotten. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols carved deep, spirals within spirals, eyes without pupils. And in the center of the floor, a circle of blackened stones with fresh blood pooling in the grooves. That's when the whispers started. Not from one direction, from everywhere, inside my head, outside my ears. Words I almost understood. A come deeper, a show us your bones, a we remember your grandfather. My grandfather, Elias Crow Sr., he vanished in these woods in '53. They never found his body. Night fell fast. No stars, no moon. Just that breathing now all around me. I lit a flare. Red light splashed across the trees, and I saw them. Figures, tall, emaciated. Skin stretched taut over jutting bone, translucent like wax paper. No eyes, just hollows where eyes should be, and mouths. Wide, lipless slits that opened vertically from chin to forehead. They didn't move toward me. They unfolded, limbs elongating, joints bending backward.